In 19th century Paris, for a man to love another man was more than just a source of shame. It was a crime against nature, a sin of Sodom, condemned by both God and society. For the Marquis Astolphe de Custine, this forbidden instinct was a lifelong sentence. By day he strolled through the salons, wearing the mask of an elegant aristocrat. But by night, he stripped away that disguise to wander the shadows, seeking the scent of rough soldiers and the thrill of dangerous warmth. Eventually, on a night in 1824, this precarious double life came to a brutal end in the mud of Saint-Denis. When he was beaten like a beast by the very men he desired, stripped naked and left for dead, the world did not comfort him as a victim. Instead, it mocked him and spat upon him as a filthy sodomite. Yet, in a twist of cruel irony, the very difference that plunged him into hell was what would later transform him into a singular prophet. As an outsider cast out by society for his sexual minority status, he possessed the unique ability to pierce the veil of civilization and power, seeing the barbarism hidden beneath more clearly than anyone else could. A man who suffered the most tragic downfall for his most secret desires. How did he transmute that deadly shame into a resounding insight that would change the course of history? To understand his end, we must understand his beginning. The seeds of this destruction were sown long before that night. Astolphe was not just a victim of 1824. He was a man born into a graveyard. Astolphe was born in 1790, a child of the French Revolution's most violent convulsions. He belonged to the crème de la crème of the old regime. His grandfather, Adam Philippe de Custine, was a hero of the American Revolutionary War and a general in the French Republican Army, a man who tried to serve the New World while retaining the manners of the old. It was a fatal contradiction. In August 1793, when Astolphe was just a toddler, the general was accused of treason by the radical Jacobins. The trial was a farce. The verdict was a formality. The general climbed the scaffold and was beheaded. But the terror was not satisfied with one head. Astolphe's father, Armand, a young diplomat of immense promise, rushed to defend the general. For the crime of defending his father, Armand was arrested. He was 25 years old. He wrote a final letter to his wife, Delphine, a letter of heartbreaking stoicism, before he too was fed to the machine. Imagine the infancy of Astolphe de Custine. He was the sole male heir to a decimated house. His first memories were not of nursery rhymes, but of his mother, Delphine de Sabran, fighting for her own life. Delphine was a woman of extraordinary beauty and iron will. Imprisoned at the Carmes prison, a place notorious for the September massacres where the walls were still stained with the blood of priests, she waited for her name to be called. She survived only by a stroke of luck and the fall of Robespierre. When she emerged from prison, she was a widow in her 20s, holding the hand of a sickly blonde boy. The Custine fortune had been confiscated, their palaces looted, their name tainted by the accusation of treason. Astolphe did not grow up playing with toy soldiers. He grew up surrounded by ghosts. He was raised with the heavy burden of being the last survivor. His mother looked at him not just as a son, but as a resurrection. He had to be brilliant. He had to be perfect. He had to justify the sacrifice of the dead. This was the psychological weight placed on his shoulders before he could even read. As the chaos of the Revolution settled into the order of Napoleon and eventually the Bourbon Restoration, Delphine de Sabran rebuilt her life. She did not just survive, she conquered. She became one of the most celebrated salonières in Europe. If she could not wield political power, she would wield cultural power. Young Astolphe was raised in a hothouse of intellect. His uncles and mentors were the giants of the age. His mother's lover was none other than François-René de Chateaubriand, the brooding genius of Romanticism, the man who practically invented the modern concept of emotional introspection. Chateaubriand was a father figure to Astolphe, but a daunting one. He was cold, egotistical, and immensely talented. From Chateaubriand, Astolphe learned that to be interesting was to be sad, and to be great was to be misunderstood. The boy grew up in a world that was fiercely matriarchal and intellectually aggressive. He was paraded before the elite of Europe, Madame de Staël, Wilhelm von Humboldt, the exiled kings and queens. He was beautiful, with a delicate, almost feminine grace that people remarked upon constantly. In the early 1800s, this was not yet a condemnation. The Romantic era prized male sensitivity. Men wept openly in novels and in life. They wrote passionate letters to one another about their souls. Astolphe thrived in this ambiguity. He was a creature of the salon, witty, sharp-tongued, fluent in arts and languages, and completely unsuited for the rough realities of politics or war. However, there was a quiet anxiety growing around him. Delphine adored her son, but she was not blind. She saw his lack of interest in women. She saw the intensity of his friendships with other young men. In the private letters of the Custine family, there is a rising tension as Astolphe reached his 20s. He was the last Custine. He had to marry. He had to produce an heir. The biological imperative of the aristocracy clashed with the private nature of the man. Astolphe tried to comply. He was not a rebel by nature. He was a desperate conformist who wanted to please his mother and restore his family's honor. But his heart was elsewhere. During his travels in Germany and Italy, he formed intense consuming attachments to men. These were not casual trysts. Astolphe was a romantic in the truest sense. He sought a union of souls. He fell in love with an Englishman. He fell in love with a German diplomat. These relationships were conducted in the coded language of the time, sublime friendship, brotherhood of the soul. But the physical reality was always hovering just beneath the surface. By 1820, the pressure had become unbearable. The Bourbon Restoration was in full swing. King Louis XVIII was on the throne, but the ultra-royalists, conservatives who wanted to turn back the clock to before 1789, were gaining power. The moral climate of Paris was shifting. The sexual fluidity of the revolutionary and Napoleonic years was ending. A new suffocating piety was taking hold. The church was reasserting its control over private life. To be a bachelor at 30 was suspicious. To be a bachelor who preferred the company of handsome guardsmen was dangerous. Delphine, sensing the danger, engineered a marriage. She found the perfect candidate, Léontine de Saint-Simon de Courtelme. She was young, noble, and wealthy. It was a union on paper that promised to secure Astolphe's future and silence the whispers. Astolphe went into the marriage with a heavy heart. His letters from this period are painful to read. He writes of duty, of sacrifice, of a profound melancholy that he cannot shake. He was trying to play a role for which he had no talent. He married Léontine in 1821. He was 31. She was barely out of childhood. For a brief moment, it seemed the deception would work. Astolphe was a kind, if distant, husband. Léontine became pregnant. A son, Enguerrand, was born. The dynasty was saved. The ghosts of the guillotined grandfather and father could rest. Astolphe had done his duty. He had provided an heir. He had established a household. He was the Marquis de Custine, a respectable peer of the realm, living in a grand estate, hosting dinners, and attending the opera. But the curse of the Custines was not finished with him. If the first act of Custine's life was defined by the guillotine, the second was defined by disease. The domestic fortress he had built to protect himself began to crumble with terrifying speed. In 1823, his young wife Leontine fell ill. It was tuberculosis, the consumption that stalked the 19th century like a specter. Astolphe nursed her. By all accounts, he was tender and attentive, perhaps driven by a guilty conscience, perhaps by genuine affection for the innocent woman he had dragged into his complex life. She died in his arms, leaving him a widower with an infant son. Astolphe was devastated. In the span of a short time, the domestic fortress he had built began to crumble. He was a widower at 34. The grief was real, but so was the terrifying freedom. With his wife and son gone, the societal imperative to pretend was weakened. His mother, Delphine, was aging. Her grip on him was loosening. The emptiness of his chateau echoed with his solitude. It was in this state of emotional wreckage that Astolphe began to drift. He was a man in pain, and pain often seeks alleviation in risk. He began to venture out of the protected salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He began to walk the streets of Paris at night. Paris in 1824 was a city of dualities. On the surface, it was the capital of the Restoration, rigid, pious, and policed. The secret police, established by Napoleon and perfected by the Bourbons, were everywhere. They monitored the theaters, the brothels, and the parks. They kept files on everyone of importance, especially the erratic aristocracy. But beneath this layer of ice, the city boiled with vice. The Palais Royal was the epicenter of debauchery, a place where gambling dens and prostitutes of both sexes mingled with soldiers and princes. The Tuileries garden at night was a hunting ground. For a man like Custine, these places were both repulsive and magnetic. He was looking for something he could not name in polite society. He was looking for a connection that was raw, immediate, and perhaps a little dangerous. He had spent his entire life being the good son, the cultured marquis, the mourning widower. He was tired of being Astolphe de Custine, the symbol of a tragic family. He wanted to be just a man. He began to take notice of the soldiers. The royal guards stationed in and around Paris were young men from the provinces, fit, uniformed, and often bored. They were known to be available for the right price or the right persuasion. It was a dangerous game. Fraternizing with the lower ranks was frowned upon. Soliciting them was a crime against nature and social order. Astolphe's behavior became reckless. He was seen in places where a marquis should not be. He was talking to people he should not know. The whispers in the salons grew louder. "Have you seen Custine lately? He looks feverish. He disappears for hours." His mother, Delphine, now living in Switzerland for her health, wrote him anxious letters. She sensed a catastrophe approaching. She begged him to remarry, to settle down, to come to her. But Astolphe was like a moth circling a lantern. He was drawn to the fire. October 1824. The autumn in Paris was wet and cold. The leaves were rotting in the gutters. The mood in the city was tense. The king, Louis XVIII, had died in September, and his brother, the hardline conservative Charles X, had taken the throne. The moral police were on high alert. They wanted to make examples. They wanted to purify the capital. Astolphe did not care about politics. He was consumed by a specific infatuation. He had fixed his eyes on a young gunner from the 5th Regiment of the Royal Guard. We do not know the soldier's name for certain. History has protected the predator and exposed the victim, but accounts suggest he was a rough, handsome man, significantly younger than the Marquis. Astolphe believed he was being subtle. He believed he was negotiating a private encounter. He did not realize that he was walking into a trap that had been baited not just by one soldier, but by a wolf pack. The soldier agreed to meet him. The location was set: the lonely road to Saint-Denis near the river. a place dark enough for secrets, but close enough to the barracks for the soldiers' friends to lie in wait. On the evening of October 28th, Astolphe de Custine dressed with care. He likely wore his fine velvet coat, his gold watch, the symbols of his station. He stepped into his carriage or perhaps hired a fiacre to avoid recognition. He told his servants he would be late. He was traveling toward his own execution. He thought he was going to find love, or at least lust, a moment of human warmth in the cold vacuum of his life. He did not know that the road to Saint-Denis was the end of the world as he knew it. He did not know that the man waiting for him was not a lover, but an executioner appointed by the prejudices of his age. As the carriage rattled over the cobblestones, leaving the lit streets of Paris for the muddy darkness of the outskirts, Astolphe de Custine was leaving behind the protection of his name, his title, and his history. He was about to become nothing more than a body in the mud. The carriage came to a halt on the dark road leading to Saint-Denis. It was a desolate stretch flanked by open fields and shadowed by trees that had been stripped bare by the autumn winds. Inside the velvet-lined cabin, Astolphe de Custine waited, his heart likely pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He was a man of the salon, a creature of refined words and delicate sentiments, now sitting in the damp blackness of a world he did not understand. He stepped out. The air was biting. The figure of the soldier appeared from the gloom. For a moment, the illusion held. But then, the script changed. The soldier did not step forward with an embrace or a whispered greeting. He signaled. Suddenly, the darkness around them moved. It wasn't just one man. It was a squad. 4 or 5 men, fellow soldiers from the regiment, emerged from the brush. They were not there to witness a tryst. They were there to enact a punishment. This was a bastonnade, a ritual beating. In the eyes of these men, they were not committing a crime. They were enforcing the natural order. They were the rough hands of society correcting the aberration of the aristocracy. The violence was immediate and overwhelming. Astolphe, slender and unaccustomed to physical combat, stood no chance. Heavy military boots kicked his legs out from under him. Fists hardened by drill and labor smashed into his face. He fell into the dirt, and the pack descended. They did not just beat him, they dismantled him. They tore at his clothes, the fine linen shirt, the tailored coat, the symbols of his noble status. They wanted him naked. They wanted him reduced to meat. They struck him with the butts of their weapons and the heels of their boots. They beat him until he stopped struggling, until he was barely conscious, gasping for air in the freezing mud. Then came the final indignity. They dragged his battered, semi-nude body to the edge of the road and heaved him into a waterlogged ditch. The mud of Saint-Denis was thick, cold, and foul. It coated his wounds, filled his mouth, and matted his hair. The soldiers stood over him laughing, perhaps spitting on the broken form of the Marquis. They took his money and his watch, not because they were simple thieves, but because taking his possessions stripped him of his last remaining leverage. They left him there to die or to survive and wish he hadn't. As their footsteps faded into the night, Astolphe de Custine lay alone in the filth, listening to the rain begin to fall. He did not die. The survival instinct is a cruel thing. It keeps the heart beating even when life, as one knows it, is over. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, or perhaps aided by a passing peasant who saw not a pervert but a dying man, Astolphe managed to crawl out of the ditch. The journey back to Paris is a blur in the historical record, a gap filled only by the imagination of pain. How does a naked, bloody man make his way back to the center of civilization? He likely looked like a revenant, a monster rising from the grave. When he finally reached his home on the Rue de la Rochefoucauld, His servants must have recoiled in horror. The master of the house, usually impeccable, was a mass of bruises and slime. A doctor was summoned. The physical wounds were severe: broken ribs, deep contusions, a face swollen beyond recognition, but they would heal. The doctor cleaned the mud from his skin, stitched the cuts, and set the bones. But as Astolphe lay in his bed shivering from shock and fever, the real infection was already spreading through the streets of Paris. A secret cannot be kept when it involves a regiment of soldiers. The men who beat him returned to their barracks, boasting of their exploit. They had taught the aristocrat a lesson. The story leaked from the barracks to the taverns, from the taverns to the journalists, and from the journalists to the police. The police report was devastating. In a different era, or with a different man, the police might have covered it up to protect the dignity of the nobility. But this was 1824. The regime was anxious about morality. They needed a scapegoat to show that the Restoration was tough on vice. The police did not pursue the soldiers for assault. They investigated the Marquis for indecency. The victim became the accused. The news hit the Faubourg Saint-Germain like a cannonball. At first there was confusion. Custine was attacked by brigands. Custine was robbed? But the details were too specific, too salacious to be ignored. The mud, the nakedness, the soldiers. The narrative shifted within 24 hours. He was no longer the victim of a violent crime. He was the architect of his own downfall. The conservative press, which viewed the liberal-leaning, artistic-y Custine family with suspicion, seized the opportunity. They didn't print the graphic details. Censorship laws forbade it, but they printed enough. They used euphemisms that everyone understood. They spoke of unnatural passions, of a deplorable incident, of the mud that sticks. The phrase l'affaire de la boue, the mud affair, was coined. It was a stroke of cruel genius. It perfectly encapsulated the situation. Custine hadn't just fallen into a ditch, he had fallen into moral filth. And unlike the dirt on his skin, this filth would not wash off. The speed of the social execution was breathtaking. In the 19th century, reputation was a tangible asset, more valuable than land or gold. It was the currency that allowed one to exist. Custine was bankrupted overnight. The first sign was the silence. When his name was mentioned in salons where he had been a star guest just a week prior, an uncomfortable hush would descend. Hostesses who had vied for his presence now struck his name from their guest lists with a stroke of a pen. It was a collective act of erasure. To acknowledge Custine was to condone his crime. To be seen with him was to risk one's own contamination. As Astolphe recovered physically, he began to test the waters, perhaps naively believing that his family name and his grief, he was, after all, a grieving widower, would offer some protection. He was wrong. He attempted to go to the opera. The opera was the beating heart of Parisian society, the place where everyone went to see and be seen. He entered his box. The reaction was immediate. People in the neighboring boxes stood up and left. The audience in the pit turned to stare, not with admiration, but with open disgust. The whispers rose like the sound of angry insects. He sat there, stiff-backed, his face burning, realizing that he was surrounded by an invisible wall. He was contagious. The betrayal of his friends was the sharpest knife. These were men and women he had grown up with, people who had eaten at his table, people who had praised his wit and his kindness. Among them was the Count de la Rochefoucauld, a man Custine considered a close ally. La Rochefoucauld did not just distance himself, he actively joined the chorus of condemnation to protect his own standing. Even the liberal intellectuals, the supposed champions of tolerance, turned their backs. They argued that Custine had gone too far, that his indiscretion threatened the reputation of their entire circle. It was cowardice masquerading as morality. And then there was Chateaubriand, the great writer, the lover of Custine's mother, the man who had been a surrogate father to Astolphe. Chateaubriand's reaction was complex and cold. He did not publicly denounce Astolphe, but he pulled away. He viewed the scandal as a vulgarity. Chateaubriand was a man of grand, tragic gestures, but he had no patience for the sordid reality of a muddy ditch. He offered no public defense. His silence was a thunderclap. The news reached Delphine de Sabran in Switzerland. It destroyed her. She had spent 30 years rebuilding the house of Custine from the ashes of the revolution. She had saved the fortune, restored the titles, and positioned her son at the center of the world. In one night, it was all undone. She rushed back to Paris, but there was nothing she could do. The damage was total. She found her son broken, not just in body, but in spirit. He was pacing the halls of their empty mansion, reading the newspaper attacks, listening to the silence of the door knocker. Delphine tried to rally support. She called in favors. She reminded people of their debts to her family. But she found that the currency of gratitude had expired. The boo was too thick. People looked at her with pity, but they would not look at her son. She realized that the name Custine, which she had polished so carefully, was now synonymous with perversion. For Astolphe, seeing his mother's shame was worse than the beating. He had failed her. He had taken the legacy of his guillotined father and grandfather, men who died for causes, however lost, and he had dragged it through the dirt for a cheap sexual thrill. The guilt was crushing. He contemplated suicide. It would have been the honorable way out. A pistol shot in the library would have provided a tragic, definitive end that society could understand and eventually forgive. But Astolphe de Custine did not pull the trigger. In the months that followed, Astolphe accepted his new reality. He described himself in a letter as a living corpse. He had died in that ditch, and the man who climbed out was someone else. The initial shock of the scandal faded, replaced by a permanent, grinding exclusion. He was not banned by law from society, but he was exiled by custom. He could walk the streets, but he walked alone. He could write letters, but few answered. This isolation forced a profound psychological transformation. Until that night, Custine had been a man of the world, desperate to fit in, desperate to be liked. He had worn the mask of the dandy, the wit, the courtier. The beating smashed the mask. He realized that the society he had worshipped was hollow. The people who had fawned over him were hypocrites. They tolerated adultery, gambling, and cruelty, provided it was done within the bounds of polite convention. But they would not tolerate him. A cold anger began to take root in his heart. It was not a fiery, explosive rage, but a glacial, hard cynicism. He began to look at the world with the eyes of an enemy. He watched the virtuous peers of the realm and saw their lies. He watched the pious priests and saw their greed. He watched the just king and saw a tyrant in velvet. He stopped apologizing. He stopped trying to beg for readmission to the clubs that had rejected him. He retreated into his own world. He began to write, not for an audience that despised him, but for himself. He wrote with a new bitterness, a new clarity. The mud affair stripped him of his illusions. It taught him that civilization is a thin veneer over barbarism. In the ditch, the soldiers had been savages in uniforms. In the salons, the aristocrats were savages in silk. There was no difference. They were all packs of wolves, waiting for a sign of weakness to tear a man apart. As 1825 dawned, Astolphe de Custine was a pariah. He was 35 years old, with half his life still ahead of him. The doors of Paris were locked. He had to find a window elsewhere. He had to find a way to live when the world told him he should be dead. And in the shadows of his isolation, he found the only person who would stand by him. Not a powerful duke, not a famous writer, but a young displaced Pole named Ignacy Górowski. As the lights of Paris dimmed for Custine, a different, quieter light began to burn. By 1826, the physical bruises from the mud affair had long faded, but the silence around Astolphe de Custine had hardened into concrete. He was living in the family mansion on the Rue de la Rochefoucauld, a place that should have been bustling with servants, guests, and the laughter of children. Instead, it was a mausoleum. The Grand Salon, where his mother had once entertained the kings of Europe, was draped in dust sheets. The chandeliers remained unlit. Astolphe moved through these rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. He was 36 years old. In the eyes of the law, he was a peer of France. In the eyes of the church, he was a widower. In the eyes of society, he was an untouchable. The isolation was absolute. When he walked down the boulevards, men he had known since childhood would suddenly become fascinated by a shop window or cross the street to avoid the contamination of a greeting. But the final severing of his ties to the old world was yet to come. In July 1826, Delphine de Sabran, the indomitable mother who had saved him from the terror and engineered his life, died. Her death was the breaking of the last anchor. Delphine had been his shield. Her reputation, forged in the fires of the Revolution and the brilliance of the Empire, had provided a thin layer of protection for her son. People might despise Astolphe, but they respected Delphine. With her gone, the buffer vanished. At her funeral, the attendance was sparse. The great waves of mourners who would have come 5 years earlier were absent. Astolphe stood by the grave, the last of the Custine, realizing he was now truly alone in a hostile universe. He was rich, titled, and free, but it was the freedom of a castaway on a desert island. However, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human heart. In this desolate landscape, Astolphe de Custine did not wither. Instead, he did something radical. He stopped trying to beg for readmission to a society that hated him. He built a new one. Enter Ignacy Górowski. If Astolphe de Custine was the embodiment of the neurotic, over-refined French aristocracy, Ignacy Górowski was pure, unadulterated chaos. A young Polish count, Górowski had fled his homeland after the failed uprisings against Russian rule. He was 23 years old when he entered Custine's life, 13 years younger than the Marquis. Górowski was everything Custine was not. He was fiery, violent, reckless, and unapologetically masculine. He was a revolutionary with a price on his head, a man who lived with a pistol in one hand and a bottle in the other. He had no patience for the subtle hypocrisies of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. He was in exile, just like Custine, but his exile was political, not sexual. They met in the shadowy margins of Parisian society, where the political refugees and the social pariahs intermingled. The attraction was immediate and intense. It was a collision of opposites. Custine was drawn to Górowski's raw vitality, his danger, his Polish soul, which the Romantics fetishized as the ultimate expression of tragic heroism. Górowski, penniless and displaced, found in Custine a savior, a patron, and a complex partner. On paper, Custine hired Górowski as a secretary or companion. In reality, it was a marriage. In 1820s France, two men living together was not illegal, but it was highly suspect. Custine didn't care. He moved Górowski into his mansion. He gave him the best rooms. He paid his debts, which were substantial and frequent. This relationship scandalized the few friends Custine had left. Górowski was not a polite guest. He was known to break furniture in fits of rage, to insult guests, and to spend Custine's money with reckless abandon. but Custine defended him with a ferocity he had never shown for himself. "He is the only one," Custine wrote, "who understands the language of my grief." In Gurowski, Custine found a mirror for his own exclusion. Gurowski had lost his country. Custine had lost his reputation. They were two shipwrecks clinging to each other in the storm. This partnership, which would last for the rest of Custine's life, fundamentally changed him. The delicate, trembling aesthete began to absorb some of the Pole's toughness. Living with a revolutionary made Custine realize that rules were meant to be broken. If the world wouldn't let them in, they would stand outside and mock the world. With his social life dead, Custine turned to the only outlet left to him, the pen. He had always dabbled in writing, but now it became a compulsion. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his existence, to prove to the sneering crowds that he was not just a muddy pervert, but a man of soul and intellect. In 1829, he published a novel titled Alois. It was a disaster, but a revealing one. The story concerned a young man who is engaged to marry but carries a terrible, unnameable secret that prevents him from finding happiness. In the novel, the secret is implied to be madness or impotence. But everyone in Paris who bothered to read it knew exactly what the code meant. Alois was Astolphe. The secret was his homosexuality. The critics savaged it. They mocked the protagonist as weak, effeminate, and whining. The book failed to rehabilitate his reputation. If anything, it confirmed the public's view of him as a neurotic narcissist. Custine was crushed, but he didn't stop. He wrote plays that were never performed. He wrote poems that were ignored. He was screaming into the void. He wanted to be a Chateaubriand, a Victor Hugo, a great man of letters. But he lacked the common touch. His writing was too internal, too suffocated by his own trauma. He traveled constantly to escape the stifling air of Paris. With Gurowski in tow, he roamed Switzerland, Italy, and England. He became a high-class vagabond. These travels were crucial. Removed from the fishbowl of Paris, Custine began to look at the world differently. He stopped looking at himself and started looking outward. He began to hone the skill that would eventually make him immortal: observation. He realized he had a gift for descriptions, for catching the atmosphere of a place, for reading the character of a nation in the faces of its peasants and the architecture of its jails. He was learning to be a reporter. By the late 1830s, Astolphe de Custine was approaching 50. He was a man of middle age, settling into a life of comfortable eccentricity. He could have faded away, a minor footnote in literary history, a rich man with a scandalous past and a bad novel. But the intellectual currents of Europe were shifting. In 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville published Democracy in America. It was a masterpiece. Tocqueville, a young aristocrat, had traveled to the United States and analyzed the future of the world, democracy. He argued with brilliance and foresight that equality was the inevitable destiny of mankind, for better or worse. Custine read Tocqueville with a mixture of admiration and jealousy. He wanted to write a book like that. He wanted to write the counterpoint to Tocqueville. If Tocqueville had gone west to study the future, democracy, Custine decided he would go east to study the past, autocracy, Russia. The idea took hold of him. Russia was the great enigma of the 19th century. It was the gendarme of Europe, the vast icy colossus that had crushed Napoleon and now loomed over the continent. It was the land of absolute power, where the Tsar was a god and the people were slaves. For Custine, Russia held a seductive appeal. Remember, he was the son of victims of the French Revolution. He hated the mob. He hated the chaos of democracy that had killed his father. In his mind, he constructed a fantasy. Russia was the land of order. It was the place where a strong ruler kept the chaos at bay. He believed, or wanted to believe, that he would find in Russia the perfect alternative to the messy, hypocritical liberalism of France. He planned to go there and write a defense of the Tsar. He would prove that autocracy, while harsh, was necessary to keep society from falling apart. He would come back with a book that would make him the champion of the conservatives, the darling of the monarchs. It was a bid for redemption. He would use the Tsar's glory to scrub off his own mud. There was another, more personal reason for the trip. Ignacy Gurowski. Custine lived with a man whose entire existence was defined by hatred of Russia. Poland had been partitioned and swallowed by the Russian Empire. The 1830 Polish uprising had been crushed with medieval brutality by Tsar Nicholas I. Gurowski's friends had been exiled to Siberia. His family's lands had been confiscated. Living with Gurowski, Custine heard the horror stories. He heard about the knout, the Russian whip, the secret police, the erasure of Polish culture. But strangely, these stories did not deter him. They fascinated him. He wanted to see this monster for himself. He also had a secret mission. He hoped that by going to Russia and ingratiating himself with the Tsar, he might be able to plead for clemency for some of Gurowski's relatives. It was a naive hope typical of Custine's blend of arrogance and kindness. As he prepared for the journey in the spring of 1839, the Polish exiles in Paris warned him. "You think you are going to a civilized country," they told him. "You are going to a facade. Everything in Russia is a lie. The Tsar will charm you, the palaces will dazzle you, but do not look behind the curtain." Custine dismissed their fears. He was a marquis. He was a famous, if notorious, writer. He had letters of introduction. He believed his status would protect him. He believed he could outwit the Russian bear. On May 9, 1839, Astolphe de Custine left Paris. He left behind the grave of his mother, the empty salons, and the memories of the ditch at Saint-Denis. He traveled toward the northern sun. He was not the same man who had been beaten 15 years earlier. The mud affair had burned away his innocence. He was cynical, observant, and deeply suspicious of human nature. He was no longer looking for love. He was looking for truth. He packed his notebooks. He packed his hidden compartments for smuggling letters. He was going into the heart of darkness, armed only with his lorgnette and his sharp, embittered wit. He thought he was going to validate his prejudices. He thought he was going to find a utopia of order. He had no idea that he was about to walk into a mirror that would reflect the very tyranny he had fled in France, magnified to a monstrous scale. The stage was set. The living corpse of Paris was about to meet the gendarme of Europe. July 1839. The steamship Nicholas I docked at Kronstadt, the fortress guarding the approach to St. Petersburg. For Astolphe de Custine, the transition was physical and violent. He had left the noisy, chaotic, argument-filled world of the West and entered a zone of absolute silence. The first thing he noticed was the eyes of the customs officials. They did not look at him, they looked through him. They were efficient, silent, and terrified. A word out of place could mean a trip to Siberia. Custine, used to the arrogant, chatty bureaucrats of France, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern wind. He realized immediately that he was no longer an individual. He was a suspect. When he finally arrived in St. Petersburg, he was struck not by its beauty but by its unnaturalness. It was a city built against nature, a fever dream of Peter the Great forced into existence on a frozen swamp. To Custine's sensitive eye, the grand neoclassical palaces looked like stage sets. The wide avenues were too empty. The squares were too vast. It was a city designed for the marching of armies, not the living of people. "It is a camp made of stone," He wrote in his secret notes, "St. Petersburg is not a city, it is a headquarters." He saw the connection immediately. Just as he had been forced to wear a mask in Paris to survive the social mud, the entire city of St. Petersburg was a mask. Underneath the gilded spires and pastel facades lay the bones of the thousands of serfs who had died building it. It was a capital city floating on a bog of blood and suffering. The mud affair had given Custine the ability to smell rot beneath perfume, and St. Petersburg reeked of it. Custine had come to Russia to praise the emperor, and initially he was seduced. Tsar Nicholas I was a masterpiece of a man, tall, imposing, with eyes of cold steel, and the bearing of a demigod. When Custine was presented to him at the Winter Palace, the Tsar turned on the charm. Nicholas knew who Custine was, a French aristocrat who hated the 1830 revolution. The Tsar saw a potential propagandist. He spoke to Custine in perfect French, complaining about the chaos of democracy and presenting himself as the weary father of his people, holding back the forces of anarchy. "I do not rule," the Tsar told him, "I command." For a few days, Custine was mesmerized. The order, the discipline, the sheer grandeur of the Russian court was intoxicating. At a grand ball in the Peterhof Palace, Custine watched 6,000 guests glide through halls lined with mirrors and candles. It was a spectacle that made the balls of Paris look like sordid tavern parties. But then, the cracks appeared. Custine noticed that the Tsar never smiled, or rather his smile never reached his eyes. He noticed that when the Tsar entered a room, the air vanished. The courtiers did not just bow, they shrank. They became automata, mere extensions of the emperor's will. Custine wrote, "The emperor of Russia is the only man in the empire who is alive. Everyone else is a ghost who breathes only by his permission." He realized that this order he had come to worship was actually a form of mass death. In France, people were free to be messy, loud, and wrong. In Russia, everyone was perfectly behaved because they were perfectly terrified. The turning point came not in the palaces, but in the streets. Custine began to feel the invisible net. He realized he was being followed. His luggage had been searched. His servants were questioned. The Russian secret police, the Third Section, was the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in the world. They were everywhere, in the hotels, in the restaurants, disguised as waiters, carriage drivers, and fellow travelers. Custine, the man who had been ambushed in the dark by soldiers in 1824, recognized the sensation. He was being hunted again, but this time, the hunter was the state itself. He became paranoid. He began to hide his true letters in the lining of his hat and in the soles of his boots. He wrote fake letters praising the Tsar and sent them through the official post, knowing the censors would read them. He was playing a double game, smiling at the court by day and documenting the horror by night. He visited the fortress of Peter and Paul, the political prison. He heard the stories of the Decembrists, the noble revolutionaries who had been rotting in Siberian mines for 14 years. He heard of Prince Trubetskoy, whose wife had followed him into exile, giving up her titles and wealth to live in a frozen hut. These stories shattered Custine's heart. He looked at the Russian aristocrats dancing at the balls and saw them for what they were: slaves, rich slaves, titled slaves, but slaves nonetheless. They could be stripped of everything on a whim of the Tsar. In France, Custine mused, tyranny is social. It excludes you from the salon. In Russia, tyranny is total. It erases you from existence. The profound irony of his journey hit him with full force. He had come to Russia to find an argument against equality. He hated the French Revolution's slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity. He thought equality meant bringing everyone down to the lowest level. but in Russia, he found the ultimate equality. Here, he wrote, everyone is equal, because everyone is equally nothing before the Tsar. The greatest prince and the lowest serf shared the same vulnerability. There was no law, only the emperor's mood. This was not the conservative utopia he had dreamed of. This was a nightmare. It was a society without dignity. Custine's own history, the humiliation of the mud affair, gave him a unique empathy. He looked at the Russian people and saw himself. They were all in the ditch. They were all muddy. They were all waiting for the boot to strike. He visited the rural villages and saw the wretched condition of the serfs. He saw them beaten by their masters, just as he had been beaten. He saw the sadness of the Russian soul, a deep melancholic resignation that permeated the land. He realized that the silence of Russia was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a victim who knows that screaming will only bring more pain. By the end of his trip, Custine was exhausted and terrified. He felt that if he stayed any longer, he would be swallowed by the prison without walls. He had seen enough. The illusion was dead. He had a choice to make. He could go back to France and write the book he had promised to write, a safe, boring travelogue praising the Tsar. If he did that, he would be celebrated by the conservatives. He would be welcomed back into the fold of the reactionary right. He would regain some social standing as a friend of emperors. Or he could tell the truth. If he told the truth, he would betray the Tsar who had treated him with kindness. He would alienate the conservatives in France who were his natural allies. He would likely be attacked again. But Astolphe de Custine was done with lies. The man who had been stripped naked in the mud had nothing left to hide. He realized that his suffering had been a preparation. It had stripped him of his fear of public opinion. I went to Russia in search of arguments against representative government. He wrote, I return a partisan of constitutions. The Russia trip had cured him of his reactionary politics. He realized that for all its flaws, the chaotic liberty of the West was infinitely superior to the peace of the dungeon. He realized that the right to speak, the right to argue, the right to be wrong, these were the only things that made life worth living. In October 1839, exactly 15 years after the mud affair, Custine crossed the border out of Russia. As his carriage passed the final guard post and entered Prussia, he felt a physical weight lift from his chest. I can breathe, he whispered. I can speak. He clutched his hidden notes, the raw material of his vengeance. He had survived the bear's den. He had looked the Gorgon in the face and not turned to stone. He returned to Paris, to his empty house, to his faithful Gurowski. He was older, grayer, and more tired, but his eyes were burning with a new fire. He locked the doors. He sat down at his desk. He dipped his pen in the ink. He was about to write the most dangerous book of the 19th century. He was about to put the Russian Empire on trial, and this time, he would be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. In May 1843, the silence that had surrounded Astolphe de Custine since the mud affair was shattered, not by a scandal of flesh, but by a scandal of the mind. La Russie en 1839, Russia in 1839, was published in Paris. It appeared in 4 volumes, a massive, dense, and blistering indictment of the Russian Empire. The reaction was seismic. In the 19th century, books could still shake governments, and Custine's book was an earthquake. It sold out immediately. Pirate editions appeared in Brussels and London. Everyone was reading it, the liberals, the conservatives, the diplomats, and the revolutionaries. They expected a travelogue. They expected descriptions of snowy landscapes and glittery balls. What they found was a psychological autopsy of a superpower. Custine did not just describe Russia, he dismantled it. He argued that the Russian Empire was a machine designed to crush the human soul, a place where fear is the only atmosphere. The writing was ferocious. The man who had been dismissed as a weak, effeminate dandy wrote with the force of a biblical prophet. He attacked the Tsar not as a man, but as a system. He described the Russian courtiers as ambitious slaves and the Russian people as victims of a Mongol tyranny masquerading as a Christian monarchy. For the French intelligentsia, it was a shock. They realized they had underestimated the muddy Marquis. The liberal poet Lamartine wrote to Custine, "You have written the most important book of our time." Even Balzac, who usually sneered at Custine, was forced to admit the book's power. The outcast had returned from the wilderness bearing fire. If the reaction in Paris was one of shock, the reaction in St. Petersburg was one of apoplectic fury. Tsar Nicholas I read the book. We can only imagine the scene. The absolute autocrat, used to being flattered by every breath drawn in his presence, reading the words of the Frenchman he had personally charmed. Custine described Nicholas not as a god, but as a jailer, a man trapped by his own power, lonely, paranoid, and ultimately hollow. He stripped the emperor of his majesty and left him naked on the page. The Tsar was reported to have thrown the book across the room. He is famously said to have shouted, "I am to blame. I am to blame for having allowed this scoundrel to enter my country." The Russian state machine sprang into action. Banning the book was not enough. They had to destroy the author. The Tsar's secret police mobilized their agents in Paris. They launched a smear campaign that was brutal even by 19th century standards. They did exactly what Custine knew they would do. They weaponized the mud affair. Russian-funded newspapers and pamphlets began to circulate, reminding the world of 1824. They called Custine a degenerate, a sodomite, a man whose brain was as sick as his morals. They argued that his hatred of Russia stemmed from the fact that Russian men were too virtuous to satisfy his unnatural lusts. But a strange thing happened. The mud didn't stick, or rather it stuck, but it didn't matter. The book was too good. The truth in its pages was too undeniable. The smear campaign backfired because it proved Custine's point that Russia was a bully that would stoop to anything to silence its critics. By attacking his personal life, they validated his political insights. For Custine, the publication was a catharsis. For 20 years, he had been the man in the ditch. Now he was the man on the mountain. He had taken the humiliation of his exclusion and turned it into a weapon of truth. He realized that his perversion, as society called it, was actually his superpower. Because he was a gay man in a straight world, he had learned to see through masks. Because he had been beaten by soldiers, he understood the violence of the state. Because he had been silenced, he understood the value of free speech. The normal travelers, the straight, respectable fathers of families, had gone to Russia and seen only the parades. Custine, the deviant, had gone and seen the prison. He never regained his place in high society. The Faubourg Saint-Germain still whispered about him. He was still the man who couldn't be invited to the most exclusive dinners. But the texture of the exclusion had changed. They no longer looked at him with contempt. They looked at him with a mixture of fear and respect. He was dangerous now. He had a voice that could ring across continents. The storm of the book eventually settled. Custine lived for another 14 years after its publication. These were quiet years, spent largely in the company of Ignacy Gurowski and a small circle of loyal friends, including the composer Frédéric Chopin. His domestic life remained unconventional. He lived with Gurowski in a relationship that was volatile but enduring. He essentially adopted Gurowski, making him his heir. trying to give legal structure to a love that the law did not recognize. It was a final act of defiance against the norms of inheritance and bloodline. Custine continued to write, but nothing ever matched the fire of Russia. He had said what he was put on this earth to say. He grew older, his health failing, his face growing more lined and melancholic. He became a relic of a bygone era, a survivor of the First Empire, the Restoration, and the July Monarchy. He died on September 25, 1857, at the age of 67. His death was relatively unnoticed by the wider world. The funeral was modest. He was buried near his mother and grandfather. On his tombstone, there is no mention of the mud affair, nor of the bestseller that shook the Tsar. He went into the ground as he had lived, a complicated private man. If the story ended there, Astolphe de Custine would be a minor historical curiosity. But books have a life of their own. For 100 years, Russia in 1839 gathered dust. It was dismissed as an exaggerated Russophobic rant. But then came 1917. The Bolsheviks seized power. The Tsar was executed. The Soviet Union rose. Suddenly, scholars in the West began to dust off the old volumes of the French Marquis. They read his descriptions of the secret police, the censorship, the purges, the fear, and their jaws dropped. Custine hadn't just described the Russia of 1839. He had described the Soviet Union of 1939. He had predicted that if the Tsar fell, something worse would take his place, because the structure of Russian tyranny was deep in the soul of the nation, not just in the crown of the monarch. During the Cold War, Custine became a sensation again. The American diplomat George F. Kennan, the architect of the containment strategy against the USSR, called it the best book ever written about Russia. He wrote, "This book is not about the past, it is about the present." The CIA read him. The KGB read him in secret. The muddy Marquis became the prophet of the Cold War. His vision was vindicated by history on a scale he could never have imagined. The life of Astolphe de Custine is a testament to the strange alchemy of suffering. In 1824, society tried to destroy him. They beat him, stripped him, and threw him into the mud of Saint-Denis. They thought they were flushing away a piece of filth. They thought that by ostracizing him, they were protecting the purity of their civilization. They were wrong. By casting him out, they accidentally liberated him. They took away his fear of losing his reputation, which gave him the courage to speak the truth when everyone else was polite. They took away his blind loyalty to authority, which allowed him to see the evil of absolute power. The mud did not destroy him, it crystallized him. It turned a frivolous aristocrat into a diamond-hard observer of the human condition. Today, nobody remembers the names of the soldiers who beat him. Nobody remembers the journalists who mocked him. Even the powerful dukes who shunned him are forgotten dust. But we remember Custine. We remember him because he looked into the abyss of tyranny and didn't blink. We remember him because he proved that the view from the gutter is sometimes clearer than the view from the throne. He was the Marquis of the mud, and in the end, he was the only one who came out clean.